It's great to be here, and I hope you remember everything that Keith said, because it's important background to the rather more abstract and perhaps slightly weirder material that I'm going to try out on you. Let me begin with a quotation from Nietzsche, who said, "Consciousness does not really belong to man's individual existence, but rather to his social or herd nature. As follows from this, it has developed subtlety only insofar as this is required by social or herd utility. Consequently, given the best will in the world to understand ourselves as individually as possible, our thoughts are continually translated back into the perspective of the herd." So I'm going to talk about this and hope to make some slight revision to what Nietzsche says. But basically, I think it is right. And I'm going to try and explain this. I'm going to begin with a conundrum, which is that when we think about the way that language relates to our emotions and what it does to verbalize an emotion, sometimes we think of this as a very important way of understanding our emotion better, of refining, for example, our appreciation of a work of art or literature. And this is my first reference to the person that Keith described as the most important person in emotions research in the last half century, who alas died 3 years ago, Nico Freida, and a colleague, Sundararajan, who wrote about the prevalence, particularly in Asian aesthetics, of the art of savoring a piece of art, or perhaps music, or literature, by talking about it. On the other hand, there are people who, in connection with certain emotions, and particularly emotions of an aesthetic nature, but also the erotic emotions, and also mystical emotions, tend to think that verbalization actually somehow debases and blunts the force of our emotions. And so I'm intrigued as to what the conditions might be under which one or the other of these attitudes seems to us more plausible. What it suggests is that there is an issue about a kind of translation between what some people have called pre-reflective feeling and the reflective awareness that we have of what we can articulate and discuss. And this issue about the articulation and discussion of our emotions is going to be central to what I want to say. Now, again, my second reference to Freida. Freida pointed out in the very last article of his that was published, actually posthumously, that you can think of an emotion as an elaboration of something far more basic, which is the simple capacity to detect and respond to some environmental condition. feeling at its most basic level is something that even a unicellular, a bacterium must possess. So it's a basic feature of life that has had about 4 billion years to evolve. Language, on the other hand, is tremendously recent. It is, in the words of the book, and actually 2 books of Maynard Smith and Zathmari, it is the last of 8 major evolutionary transitions. The invention of language, which is probably less than 100,000 years old. So it's a new invention, and it's completely different from what had already been going fine for 4 billion of years, the capacity to detect and respond. It wouldn't be surprising if these 2 things didn't mesh all that easily together, given how far apart they lie in their origins. Now, what makes a major transition in evolution? Maynard Smith and Zathmari list 3 features in particular, among others. There is in these major transitions some units that lose some of their original autonomy, and they come to collaborate together or to form parts of a greater whole. This results in a division of labor and task specializations, so that our original bacterial cells, which now form the somatic cells of our body, have different functions in our body. And the third thing they list, which is particularly important for my purposes, is changes in modes of information storage and transmission. Now, I want to distill these ideas into 2 major and interesting contrasting features of those major transitions. On the one hand, a major transition of evolution brings new constraints on the existing entities. On the other hand, these constraints lead to an explosion of new possibilities, concrete possibilities that could not have been conceived beforehand. For example, sexual reproduction imposes enormous constraints. For example, you get a good thing going and you never make it again. Reproduction is a misnomer. There's no such thing as human reproduction, because you never do make another entity which is like the one you are reproducing. On the other hand, you now have an explosion of new possibilities that arise from the recombination of genes. And of course, going even further back, multicellularity. The constraint is that the autonomy originally possessed by these single cells is something they give up in order to collaborate and to become part of one bigger thing. So, what might be the constraints and the novel possibilities generated by the invention of language? That's my question. Now, I want to say that speech involves, I won't say speech is, although one might be tempted to say that, but certainly speech involves digital systems of representation. What does that mean? Digital contrasts with analog. The world is neither analog nor digital. Analog and digital is a distinction that applies to systems of representation. Now, here's the constraint. In analog copying, accuracy admits of degrees. If somebody gives you a drawing and says, copy that, you can copy it as well as you possibly can, and you can get very, very close, but you'll probably make some slight error. In a digital system of representation, you avoid that slight error by allowing yourself a whole bunch of errors and just not counting them. Because a digital system of representation starts by setting out a whole bunch of basic units of representation. Now, digitality is actually an invention of Plato's, though he didn't know what he was doing. In Plato's theory of forms, no two individuals resemble each other, as it were, directly. Each of us is a human being and resembles one another in being a human being. But that's only because each one resembles the, as it were, paradigm human beings. And this is best modeled by the alphabet. When you copy a particular, say, A, you can get a very different A, because you're not really copying this. What you're doing is, first, you realize that this is actually an instance of an A. And so, instead of copying the original, you copy the paradigm. And that's why we can copy a text over and over and over again with an amazing accuracy and reliability. So, here is the new constraint, and here is the new possibility. With a digital system of representation, you have almost perfect fidelity. Not absolute fidelity, but almost perfect fidelity. And the other natural system of representation which is digital that is known is, of course, the genetic system, the DNA. Here again, you have extraordinarily accurate, but not absolutely accurate. If they were absolutely accurate, would all still be bacteria. Systems of reproduction, which are based on there being a conventional small set of basic units, which everything has to be slotted into. So if these basic units are inappropriately chosen, for example, many of you remember the times when people used to complain that digital systems of musical representations were inadequate because you just couldn't hear the subtlety involved in the exact sound waves when you got the sound waves reproduced by means of a sampling of absolute numbers that were then put together to represent the curve of the frequency. So if the sampling is too low, the music will seem jerky. Now, music and images can always increase resolution by taking a more accurate sampling. But in speech, what is it to increase resolution? Well, basically, it is to add words. So here's my hypothesis. And here I want you to remember what Keith was saying about the social importance of our conversations about emotions. Robin Dunbar, a sort of, what would you call him, an anthropologist, psychologist, has put forward the view that gossip was the essential driver of human evolution. When the size of our little tribes became too large for us to groom one another and pick the bugs off one another's fur, you could no longer relate to everybody. So instead, you went in for gossip. And in gossip, what are you doing? You're doing the essential things that we do in conversation and in science. We generalize, we predict, we explain. In short, we gossip. I call this pegging. Pegging, I suggest, is what has driven our capacity to talk in general, but in particular to talk about what we feel. Dunbar pointed out that there are several advantages over grooming to gossip. You can talk to several people at once. You can only groom one person at a time. You can do other things with your hands while talking. And you can find out about people who aren't there. So, as a consequence, what happens is that, and this is a quote from Dunbar, humans are able to maintain a better knowledge database on a larger social network than any other non-human primate. And they do this with language, and this requires them to grow enormous brains so you can keep track of it all. And not just that, but once you have language, you also can do what other apes cannot quite do, despite the fact that they have some measure of what Keith called, what psychologists called theory of mind. That is to say, they have an ability to see the relevance of what others might be thinking. So you can easily find a chimp, for example, behaving differently in the presence of a certain alpha male who might otherwise threaten them in relation to either food or mating, watching to see if they're being watched, and aware that it makes a difference whether or not they're being watched by that particular person because that particular person knows, etc. But what they can't do is they can't go to higher levels of intentionality. So I can see that S is watching me, but I can't think without language that S knows that I believe that S thinks that I know he's there. Right? That gets too much. For that, you need language. Now, when do we need language to express emotions? We experience a large variety of emotions. 25 quadrillion, to be exact, as I'll show you in a moment. Now, pegging requires us to categorize socially significant emotions for dissemination and example and exchange of social information and gossip, as we've seen. Furthermore, social intelligence is tremendously complicated because people are always thinking about how to respond to how you're going to behave, and you have to predict how they think you are going to respond to what they do, etc., etc. You see, so this meta-representation places tremendous demands on the development of our brains. And it's a development that leads to what people have called Machiavellian intelligence, which is very specifically not just an intelligence of how to manipulate things, but an intelligence about how to manipulate people. And people who have this unpredictable way of responding to your own unpredictable actions. Now, I submit that we still have, if you like, a realm of experience which we don't particularly need to communicate. Private experience. insofar as a certain kind of experience is just that, an experience, and we don't need to talk about it, well, then it may not need verbalization. However, and this is what Nietzsche was suggesting and what Ali Hochschild has shown we do all the time, we tend to think that we can, as it were, bring back into the description of our own experience the terminology with which we discuss public experience. We conform to feeling rules. That is, in this situation, you're supposed to feel this way. In that situation, you're supposed to feel this way. So I must be feeling that way because that's the way I'm supposed to be feeling. And of course, this could be, if we allow that there is such a thing as private experience in the first place, a simple mistake. So how many possible emotions are there? Okay, here's a way of calculating. In the Geneva questionnaire, in which Klaus Scherer and his team showed that you could pretty much predict how an emotion would be labeled on the basis of responses to about 20 questions, each of which asked you to appraise something. There are 20 such dimensions. 5 of them, for example, did this event require you to react immediately? Would be a yes or no, just binary. But about 15 of them admit of degrees. Let's suppose that we can distinguish 10 degrees in answer to how different is this event from what I expected. Very, very different, 10, not at all different, 1, or somewhere in between. Now, you can easily see that this yields 25 times 10 to the 15th, that is to say, 25 quadrillion emotions. So if you wanted to know how many emotions there are, that's the answer. Now, the longest list of emotion words I've been able to find has about 800 entries. That's 100 times more than the average list of basic emotions, fear, surprise, anger, etc. But it's still several quadrillion short of all the possible emotions in Scherer's emotion space. Now, you often hear it said that a picture is worth 1,000 words. How much is 1,000 words worth? Steven Pinker has suggested a way of calculating this. And he points out that if you have 10 words to choose from at every point, then you will have 10 to the power of 20 sentences, 20 words long. You will have, if you allow a bit more than that, like 100 words at every choice point, and you're given 1,000 words, well, you can cover a 1,000-word page with 10 to the power of 2,000 different sentences. Now, just to give you a sense of scale, remember that it is estimated in the entire universe that is perceived, in the known universe, there are about 10 to the power of 83 atoms. In other words, the number of possible emotions and the number of possible 1,000-word texts is super astronomical, just way beyond anything we can conceive, even when we're thinking of the longest possible sentences. The largest possible astronomical numbers. So this whole thing isn't about quantity after all. It's somehow about the question of how the non-conceptual content, which we get from perception and we get from the experience of emotion, might actually be ineffable, as we say, versus how we can translate that into a conceptual content. The question is, what would be the standards here? Now, I want to go back to this idea that we have, on the one hand, a very old system of processing what happens to us. It's the intuitive system. It's fast, overlearned, maybe evolved, informationally encapsulated. That means that just once you have something, it's very difficult for it to be changed by getting more information. And it involved analog representations versus the system which I believe is driven by language, which I call the analytic system. Now, many of you may be familiar with the very, very wonderful and famous book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow. So you can think of the intuitive as what Kahneman calls the intuitive, the thinking fast. The analytic is the one that's driven by language. Now, here's what I want then to conclude. When we verbalize an emotion, we have to somehow find equivalence between experiences that are the results of billions of years of evolution and turn them into a new way of representing this, which is less than 100,000 years old. Most of our lives is ruled by the intuitive system. But when we start thinking about something difficult, like how to get a rocket on the moon, we can't do that by the seat of your pants. However, there still are private experiences. And maybe there is an arbitrary preference that we may have for some experience to somehow remain unverbalized. Some people just might have a preference for wordless bliss. Others value verbalization as giving us at least an illusion of understanding that we otherwise don't have. I think this is in part, perhaps, a result of what I call individual temperament, something that tends to be underestimated in philosophy. And that temperament might be, in part, shaped by a socially constructed ideology, insofar as we do often think that we just should feel whatever we're supposed to feel. But, in part, it may be somehow innate. So here's how I would slightly modify Nietzsche's insight. And this is my last slide. It's not so much consciousness that belongs to the herd, but it is our conceptual scheme. Although there's no such thing as a private language, as Wittgenstein is famous for having pointed out, there still is such a thing as private experience. And it is only insofar as we import the labels that we've had to use for what I called pegging, prediction, explanation, generalization for gossip, that our own conception of our own emotions needs to go back to the level of the herd. We may choose to do that, or we may choose to resist it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronnie. Do you have time for questions?
Very, very interesting, and I love this idea of sort of asking when might language sort of enhance our experiences versus detract. And you sort of mentioned at the end, maybe some of this has to do with personal preferences. But I also wondered if some of this has to do with the particular emotions, right? You talked about quadrillions of emotional possibilities. And it seems to me like some of those emotions we might think of as more evolutionarily ancient. Fear, rage might be shared with our ancient cousins, whereas something like awe or compassion or even empathy might be more recent, more social, more public, or at least other oriented. And so I guess I wondered whether you've thought about or whether you have evidence for language sort of promoting one kind of emotional experience but not another.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. That was an excellent question. And of course, one thing I might have said is that a number of the standard emotions, like anger, for example, or fear, are ones in which the connection with the tendency to respond, the tendency to run away or attack, is so powerful that you may not have any time or inclination to be simply relishing the experience, right? Which is why I particularly singled out the erotic, the mystical, and the aesthetic. Now, in the realm of the aesthetic, you know, I think that this is one of the places where it seems there is that kind of option. The same thing is true about the erotic. Now, some people like to talk while making love. Other people actually think that destroys the whole experience. And in our society generally, we suffer from all kinds of taboos about talk of sex that actually makes it very difficult for people faced with a kind of absence of a vocabulary in terms of which to talk about erotic experience, to say anything very much about it. And I think that that is actually a grave defect of the kind of taboo-written conventions that we have in our society. But it seems to me that to a certain extent, the fact that we, and I do mean we, in this Western privileged society that we belong to just by virtue of being here today, we have a kind of leisure to, as it were, draw back from the engagement that emotion seems to be dictating into the practical and to contemplate. And of course, one of the ways in which we do that is precisely by reading literature. And somebody like Shakespeare or Proust is able to use those 1,000 words to draw incredibly fine pictures of what is experience is our private experience. And so thank you for that question, and I hope that that sort of touches on what you wanted to ask.
Yes, I just want to ask, is there any correlation between culture and verbalization and feelings?
I'm sure that there is. And this is something, I mean, certainly there's lots of stereotypes of that sort, right? If you're English, you don't talk about your emotions. We don't talk about that sort of thing here. We just, you know, stiff upper lip and get on with it. And it's reputed that, you know, some cultures find it easier to talk about their emotions to one another, and some find it more difficult. So I certainly think that there is a cultural element to this. I just lack the knowledge of exactly how, other than in those stereotypes, it actually pans out. And I'm inclined to think that even within cultural differences, personally, I don't really believe in culture. I think that individual differences exist in all cultures, and just as sex differences are just merely a slight statistical offsetting of two bell curves in which most people are in the middle anyway, so that, I mean, in the intersection. So for every man in this room, I can find a woman somewhere more masculine. For every woman in this room, I'm sure I could find a man somewhere who's more feminine. Given any criterion, though God knows there's confusion about what those are, about what is masculine and what is feminine. And I think much is the same for culture. It seems to me that the variation within a culture is always much greater than the variation among cultures, and I'm inclined to believe that temperament is something real.
This is somewhat related, I suppose. You talked about pleasurable emotions. What about traumatic emotions in the relationship of talk therapy, psychoanalytic therapy in particular?
Now, as Keith mentioned, actually, there's lots of research that shows that talking about difficult emotions can have a therapeutic effect. And now, in the case of traumatic emotions, I think that one of the ways in which you might choose to actually single out those that cause post-traumatic syndrome of some sort are precisely those cases where talking about them has become extraordinarily difficult. But I mean, I don't know. I'm not a psychologist, and I don't know the research on this as well as I should. I rather suspect that the current passion for trigger warnings is actually counterproductive, because it precisely protects free people from what actually may be the best way in which they could address these traumatic experiences, which is by gradually becoming able to talk around them and then get closer and closer to the experience itself. So yes, I think that that's definitely a very important area of inquiry.
You said that a questionnaire with 20 questions has some number of quadrillion dimensions. This puzzles me. If I walk into a hardware store, I can find 20 measuring instruments. Are there X number of quadrillion dimensions that I can measure with those 20 instruments that the SIE doesn't know about?
Well, if one measures temperature, one measures length, the third measures altitude, the fourth measures density, and so on, those are what I would call dimensions. By definition, although when psychologists use the word dimension, they're a bit wobbly about this, but in theory, mathematically, dimension is a parameter which can vary independently of the other parameters that measure the other dimensions. So insofar as those are genuine dimensions, that would be the case. Now, whether Scherer's dimensions are really quite independent in that sense is something I will not venture to judge. I mean, obviously, my little calculation was somewhat whimsical, and it was meant just to sort of illustrate a way in which you can think about the huge possibilities afforded by experiences which are affected by these different parameters, which are rather arbitrarily separated into 5 binary and 10 admitting of degrees.
Is this on?
Yeah.
It is. Thank you very much. That was very informative. I have a question on the language issue and the evolution of language. For light reading, I'm reading Harari's book on the origin of Homo sapiens. You know,
Wonderful book.
History.
Lots of fun.
But you mentioned that language emerged about 100,000 years ago. Would it, another hypothesis be that language emerged as the ape or human species evolved from small groups or herds or families to increasingly larger groups over several million years, and that language evolved over that million years to allow people to communicate as groups got it larger and larger and more distant?
Well, that certainly
I assume you didn't mean to apply that 1,000 years ago somebody started reading novels, and that was... Ignore the last comment.
There's a lot of, if you try to read the literature on the evolution of language, there's a huge spread. Some people think it's less than 100,000 years old, and of course it depends what is the criterion for saying this is really human language. And there are a number, and there was a review article by a linguist called Fitch that's fairly recent that suggests that there are, actually I should have brought a slide of his sort of graphic on this. There are a huge number of things that go into our capacity to talk, including some physical things that have to do with our actual breathing organs. And it was until recently, for example, it was thought that chimps couldn't talk because they couldn't form, they didn't have the right physical formations to actually produce the sounds of human phonemes. And this, I think, is now thought to be wrong, that they do possess those. They're among those things that our ancestors brought to language. And then the things, so the last sort of crowning achievements that made it into language as we know it appear to have been the possibility of recursion, that is to say, the possibility of thinking of the cat that the mouse saw was eaten by the dog, you know, that kind of thing, where you have multiple things that are multiple clauses that refer inside to further clauses, etc. So recursion is something that is characteristic of human languages, despite one researcher who thinks that there's one tribe called the Pirahã somewhere that don't do recursion and that also don't know how to count past 5. And the other thing is, more generally, certain kinds of phrase structure grammars. So these are fairly technical things that have grown, as it were, on top of all the abilities for communications, both gestural and vocal, which are found in other animals and which don't yet, according to linguists in general, constitute genuine language. So in other words, my answer to your question is, I don't know.
One last question.
Okay, just memory. I'm curious if you look at, or if you looked at memory in terms of feeling how language affects the construction of memory, because you have presumably more fundamentally the memory of feelings that is captured without language. I would agree. I would presume you agree. But then you have talking's overlay of the concepts as well, but you still presumably have this separation of feeling memory and language memory. And do you have anything to say about that?
Yes, there is actually some very interesting research by somebody called Skula into what is known as verbal overshadowing. And now, verbal shadowing is regarded as a paradoxical phenomenon, because what happens is that you ask people to say, look at a bunch of pictures of people and say, I want you to remember these people so you can recognize them later, memory, right? And to one group, you say, use as many mnemonic terms and descriptions as you can possibly find to help you remember them. And to the other says, just remember them. And it turns out that the use of verbalized mnemonics actually hinders rather than helps in some of those cases. Now, this is a very controversial thing because that same schooler has become famous for drawing attention to the failure of replication, which is a very general problem in psychology, and which particularly affected that very finding. So that it turns out that there are situations under which you get something like verbal overshadowing, particularly, for example, if you ask non-experts to describe a wine and then ask them to remember it in terms of their terminology, which is just confusing. So they do even worse than without. But wine experts do have a whole terminology, and once you've developed a very articulate terminology, then it turns out that verbalization does help memory. And so, in other words, it's a complicated picture, but a very good question.
And it has real implications for police work, where you ask people to give descriptions of a suspect, because what you're doing is asking them to verbalize what the person's face looks like, and at least under some circumstances, that will make their memory worse. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ronnie.